They emptied my college fund for her wedding. Then the receipts brought everything down. The email from the bank arrived like a cough in a quiet room. One-line subject, an attachment with the polite gravity only statements possess. I opened it at my kitchen counter between a chipped mug and a stack of takeout menus, and watched numbers fail to be themselves. The Coleman Education Trust, the college fund my grandmother opened when I was 9, boring and invincible by design, had fallen in neat $1,950 and $2,400 steps over 6 weeks. The way water slips down a stairwell when the door at the top has been left ajar. Fees had been reversed with suspicious courtesy. Transfers wore descriptions that could pass for errands, accounting adjustment, authorized internal, beneficiary convenience. None of them was the truth. The folder with my grandmother's handwriting, thin, square letters that never surrendered to cursive, lived on the top shelf of the hall closet. Inside, her letter of intent said the fund could be touched by me, or in an emergency by the trustee she named, but only for education or health, and only with written notice. My name and social were on the beneficiary line in her dated pen. The trustee she named had been my mother. The power she gave her had been limited, bounded by 2 short paragraphs and a margin note that read like gnomic wisdom. Don't let help become accessed. My kitchen at noon is an honest witness. Sunlight falls across the butcher block in a square that moves with the hour, catching dust and truth. I laid the statement in that square and traced the debits with a pencil the way you trace a scar to understand how long it's been there. The amounts landed on Fridays, 2 days after my sister Alyssa had posted countdown to forever photos with rented glassware and pastel florals, the captions dozing in the glow of borrowed certainty. The bank trail and the wedding board were too synchronized to be coincidence. The amounts were tailored to what I knew about vendors and deposits without ever having to ask. Grief is loud. Betrayal is methodical. When my grandmother died, the fund kept breathing because that had been the point. Something built to outlive drama. She had chosen First Harbor Bank because its websites were ugly and its tellers remembered faces. She had added a power of attorney for my mother when I was a teenager, the kind of safety valve practical people install and forget. I hadn't forgotten. I'd ignored it. The POA came with an expiration tied to my 18th birthday and a clause that looked benign until it mattered, revoked upon beneficiary majority unless reaffirmed in writing. I had never reaffirmed. I had never been asked. And yet the movement on the screen suggested someone had found a way to resurrect a tool that should have stayed behind glass. I build a table the way I always do when panic thinks it deserves the room. Date. Amount. Memo. Screen capture of Alyssa's planning posts. Calendar dots for vendor timelines. Patterns do not enjoy being named. They lose their alibi. The bank's audit trail, limited in the consumer portal but not completely. Shy, showed IP addresses that weren't. Mine and device fingerprints that pretended to be helpful by, leaving polite hex strings in their wake. One entry, an authorized internal transfer, bore a teller ID number I recognized from a card stapled to a new account brochure in my mother's kitchen. A woman with perfect nails who loved the phrase, "We can just do that for you." Smoothing is a verb people use when they want to reframe friction as customer service. That I pulled my grandmother's folder apart on the counter until the letterhead looked like a paper fort. The POA sat in its plastic sleeve with my mother's name and a date that should have gone to sleep when I could buy my own beer. In the margin, in my grandmother's hand, a line of practical tenderness. Education is a future. Events are a day. The simplicity landed like judgment. My spine found new steel.I in the spare bedroom. A plastic bin held the detritus of someday organizing. Old tax forms. A cracked photo frame. A zipper bag of cables that had mutated into a small bad mood. At the bottom, the hard envelope from Harbor Vault rested where I'd shoved it when she died, because grief and filing cabinets do not get along. Inside lay the trust's original certificate, a schedule of conditions, and a single-page addendum signed the year I turned 17. It named a successor trustee if my mother could not serve with fidelity. It named me. It also appended 3 additional words beside the POA reference. Non-durable, non-renewed. My grandmother had understood that paperwork, like kindness, should not be infinite. That I made coffee too strong and wrote a list that did not apologize for itself. Request full bank logs, teller cameras, teller IDs, access history, Freeze outward transfers from the fund. Certify POA expiration with Harbor's Legal. Pull social traces for the IPs in the portal logs. My laptop and my patients are often at odds. Today they agreed to march. The bank's secure message inbox coughed up a "will be in" touch, the kind you get when a manager reads your second paragraph and decides to sit up straighter. The kitchen light shifted across the statement to a new square on the block. My grandmother's letter felt like an engine when I held it. A small one, reliable, not pretty enough to brag about. A wedding is a day. An education is a decade. She had built the fund to survive both joy and need, not to subsidize a floral Pinterest board. The phrase beneficiary convenience on the memo line felt like a dared at 4:11 p.m. First Harbor called with the tone banks use when they've realized the other person reads fine print for sport. The representative said words like investigation and temporary hold. She asked if I had ever executed a renewal POA. I said no. She asked if my mother had provided one. I asked for their copy, their notary journal, and the camera footage from the branch that processed the authorized internals on 3 Fridays any teller could find. The pause on the line sounded like someone covering the receiver to ask a colleague how much trouble an adult child can make when he uses nouns like tools. Evening. Found the apartment above me boiling pasta with theatrical aggression. I stood at my window and watched the city pretend that money is a neutral language. My phone buzzed with a calendar invite from Alyssa titled Bridesmaid Dress, fitting with a heart emoji for punctuation. I stared at the heart like it was a glyph from a civilization that loved debt. I declined with the same quiet I use when I close doors I paid for. On my desk, the bank exported an access log report with more generosity than I expected. Masked IPs, device footprints, timestamps, access types. One footprint matched my mother's tablet, the one with a floral case that had seen more kitchens than emails. The IP traced back to her house. Another footprint did not belong to her. It belonged to a branch terminal. My stomach did that slow, disloyal roll bodies do when the head starts winning. Somewhere between a teller who can just do that for you and a mother who believes family is a shared instrument. My grandmother's rules had been reinterpreted into a wedding loan I had not consented to make. The last page in the folder, 1. I don't remember noticing at 19, was a note in my grandmother's narrow print. Paper thin and edged with the ghost of a notary's seal. If they call it help, ask who gets the receipt. I placed it on top of the stack like a banner I hadn't earned yet and set an alarm for a morning that intended to be administrative war night. Isn't quiet when you've found the hole where your future is supposed to sit. The fridge motor came on and stayed on. Streetlight turned the blinds into prison bars when you are in a mood for metaphor. I let myself think about tuition, spreadsheets, and the way my grandmother's hands had folded over the envelope. From Harbor Vault, like she was passing me a map. The map still worked. Someone had tried to redraw the river. In the morning, Harbor's Legal would be asked to say non-durable out loud. The teller footage would have faces. The logs would have minutes. The language would stop being polite, and in a vinyl binder in a house across town. I knew with a certainty I was ashamed to have earned that my name had been used as a line item on Alyssa's wedding budget, written in pencil that assumes erasers exist for ethics. Banks answer slowly until a policy wakes them up. By mid-morning, First Harbor's legal department had converted my secure message into a case number, and the branch manager called with the crisp caution of someone who hears compliance breathing on the line. Access logs arrived in a PDF that smelled like warm toner even on a screen. Device fingerprints, masked IPs, employee IDs tied to transactions labeled authorized internal. The column that mattered repeated a teller number I had already traced from a brochure stapled to a welcome packet in my mother's kitchen. The pattern didn't blink. Fridays, late afternoon. Amounts that stepped just under soft thresholds like someone measuring with a cup instead of a ladle. The branch footage took longer, then landed with the indifferent honesty of a fixed camera. On 3 Fridays, my mother stood at the counter with a manila folder and the posture of a person who calls intrusion assistance. The teller leaned in with the expertise of someone paid to remove friction. Forms slid across laminate and came back stamped. A printer spit a slip that said beneficiary convenience. The lens never lies about pace. It captured the way familiar people move, swift, unembarrassed, practiced. The copy of the renewed POA followed as if it had always existed. It wore my grandmother's name and my mother's authority like a suit 2 sizes off. The date pretended to sit after my 18th birthday. The language pretended to be durable. The signature block pretended to be ink. Under magnification, the seal feathered into the page the way toner does when it thinks it can act like pressure. The notary stamp's commission number matched a name in a public registry. The journal it should have lived in did not match any line in that notary's book. The bank forwarded a notarization report that read like a shrug. Affixed seal observed by teller. Customer known to branch. Original not retained. Familiarity doing the work of formality. Compliance, once interested, becomes a metronome. A courtesy hold froze further movement from the trust pending verification. Requests traveled outward to the notary of record, Denise Clark, a woman whose tidy log surrendered dates without persuasion. Her book recorded many ordinary things, and not the thing my mother had claimed. The bank escalated the POA to legal with a margin note that did not try to be pretty, non-durable, non-renewed per original instrument. Renewal document authenticity unresolved. The word sat on the page like a brick. Money leaves footprints even when it thinks it is tiptoeing. The withdrawals split and drifted toward vendors whose names had been decorating my sister's captions for weeks. A venue with white shiplap and deliberate vines. A florist who treats eucalyptus like punctuation. A DJ company whose invoices read like playlists. The amounts in my statement rhymed with their deposits. On one invoice, the billing contact line listed my mother's email beside a note that said Family Trust Facilitating, internal. The word internal is polite until a ledger repeats it. I pulled the thread that lives between social life and receipts. Months ago, Alyssa had shared a planning spreadsheet with me in the hopeful period before budgets declared themselves. The link still lived in my inbox. The sheet had grown tabs like Ivy, vendors, budget, wish list, and a column labeled source filled with optimistic money. Midway down, 2 entries wore my last name as if it were a bank, Coleman Fund, Education Won't Mind, and Mom POA, okay. The comment attached to the second was 12 weeks old and careless. Bank says we can smooth this. Smoothing again. Reframed friction, rebranded consent. Afternoon narrowed to administrative choreography. I bundled the original trust certificate, the addendum with non-durable. Non-renewed in my grandmother's tidy hand. The bank's hold notice, the footage stills, the notary's negative journal entry, and the vendor invoices into a packet that read like a spine. The subject line to legal used verbs that make desks clear. Certify POA expiration. Reverse unauthorized transfers. Preserve teller footage. Escalate exception handling. The response arrived with a heat signature. A fraud review opened. The phrase potential employee facilitation made its first appearance. Cool and heavy to AT home. The kitchen resumed its witness duties. Sunlight moved across the butcher block and left the numbers no place to hide. I mapped the withdrawals against the planning sheet until each payment found its vendor twin. The venue deposit aligned with a step in my statement. The florist retainer aligned with another. A rental company's save-the-date charge completed the triangle. The amounts kept to their careful dance below thresholds. The way people walk under low doors to avoid leaving a mark. Evening pressed itself against the windows and the apartment above resumed its habit of boiling pasta as performance. I filed a complaint with the state notary board. The form allowed little room for adjectives, which made it perfect. I sent a clean packet to a consumer protection unit that knows how to read beneficiary convenience as motive. I called my grandmother's old attorney, a man who rearranges sentences like furniture until a room fits again, and left a message that did not flatter me to say out loud. My mother used a bank relationship to convert education into florals. The bank's final email of the day arrived with the kind of restraint that tells you more than it says. All further activity blocked. Reversal under review. Employee placed on leave pending investigation. Requesting any additional evidence of original intent. I photographed my grandmother's letter of intent in direct sunlight, so the pen scratches showed where her hand dug in on the words education and health. The image looked like a witness. Night found me at the desk building a timeline that would survive an auditor's frown. POA granted, non-durable. Majority reached, no renewal, trust flows. Withdrawals, branch footage. Vendor receipts, planning sheet, smoothing. At the end of the line, I left a blank box for the part no bank can solve. The family meeting where people assign virtue to spending they enjoy. I didn't plan to argue. I planned to present. Paper, once it has a spine, does not raise its voice. Just before midnight, the spreadsheet flickered as if someone else had opened it. The source column changed on 2 lines. Coleman Fund became gift in a new color, the kind of edit that hopes to be mistaken for age. My inbox chimed with a shared doc notification I had forgotten to disable. The edit history stamped the change with my sister's login and a minute count too fresh to ignore. Revision history is a ledger that refuses to be charmed that I closed the laptop and stood at the window long enough to let the city turn into a screensaver. The blind slats cut the light into honest shapes. Tomorrow would be a branch visit under the eye of someone who speaks audit as a first language. A notarization complaint in transit, a fraud team converting my story into codes and checkboxes, and a reversal line item. The wedding would still be a day on the calendar. The fund would need to be a decade again. My grandmother's note, the one about receipts, stayed on top of the stack. The paper had begun to answer its own question. Outside, a siren took a long breath and let it go. Inside, the refrigerator clicked off. The silence felt earned. Branches look friendly until compliance starts taking notes. The glass doors breathed cold air over carpet that smelled like toner and citrus, and every surface gleamed with the kind of hygiene that pretends mistakes don't happen here. A manager escorted me past the line to a small room with a camera sitting openly in the corner, the institutional reminder that memory would not rely on anyone's recollection today. A binder arrived first, fat and expressionless. Then a gray tray with still frames printed from overhead footage. And finally, a single-page memo from legal that had learned how to speak without adjectives. The memo declared the Coleman Education Trust POA non-durable by original instrument, expired at majority, and not renewed. The binder confirmed what the memo said by refusing to contain anything that could contradict it. No renewal forms, no notary journal entry, no signature logs that could survive scrutiny. A separate tab carried teller access codes and timestamps tied to those Friday transfers. The sequence of screens a bank terminal must pass through to touch a trust it does not own. The codes told their own story: assisted transaction, override, relationship accommodation, beneficiary convenience. Policy had been bent at the counter with a familiar smile. The printed frames took turns describing the afternoons I had been somewhere else. My mother's folder opened along laminate. The teller's posture leaned into the work of smoothing. A slip printed with numbers that only look tidy when you are not counting futures. In each still, the body language wore history like perfume, confident, familial, unhurried. It was not malice. It was permission misremembered as entitlement. The audit trail grew patient under my pen. Teller ID repeated across Fridays. Device fingerprint for a branch terminal appeared on the access log I had exported the night before. A split-screen inset showed the same terminal executing a test mode seconds after the last transfer. The sort of diagnostic you run when you know the step you took needs to look routine. Compliance called it pattern consistency. Sitting there, it felt like choreography. The reversal process read like a recipe that had learned to respect heat. Credits would post back in the order debits left, each annotated with a code that would speak fluently to a downstream auditor. RVRL and auth internal, RVRL TRSD override, FCNCL. The manager's tone stayed clinical as she walked through the timeline. A teller had been placed on leave, human resources involved, statements preserved, and an employee report filed under the COM headline Potential Facilitation, Trust Access Exception. The room did not expect thanks. It expected acknowledgement that the machine had started to correct itself. Outside the branch, a different machine attempted to write me into its story. The wedding master contract had been updated overnight and shared to my email with the bright confidence of a spreadsheet that believes formatting is consent. My name sat in a new column as sponsor, merged cells stacking deposits I hadn't authorized into a single tidy number. A narrative engraved in Arial. Each vendor line in the contract mirrored the debits that had been walking out of my grandmother's fund. At the bottom, a note chirped the same word I had begun to distrust: smoothed via family trust. Revision history timestamped the change before midnight. Back home, the kitchen reclaimed its role as staging ground. The reversal memo joined my grandmother's letter of intent and the trust's non-durable. Non-renewed addendum under a shaft of noon light that made the embossed seals look like witness marks. I mapped each reversal code to its theft twin until the page read like restitution. The sums aligned. The fund would breathe again. The problem had never been whether the bank could fix math. It had been whether I would confuse repair with forgiveness. The packet for law enforcement assembled itself with a kind of grim elegance. Access logs, still frames, teller override codes, notary board's negative confirmation, vendor contracts with my name promoted from beneficiary to underwriter without asking. The decision that remained did not belong to a bank. File a criminal complaint and let consequence walk its measured path, or draw a line at restitution and insist on a set of conditions written plainly enough to survive another decade. An admission on paper that the POA was not renewed, a formal apology, and a promise signed by both my mother and sister that the education trust would be treated as untouchable infrastructure, rather than a rainy day purse. Evening descended with the quiet weight of a choice deferred for one sleep. The fund's ledger ticked backward as reversals posted in sequence, tiny green entries in a column that had been bleeding gray. The balance returned to a number that matched the envelope my grandmother had held over that harbor vault counter years ago. Relief arrived, but it refused to masquerade as absolution. Near midnight, the spreadsheet flickered a final time. A cell note appeared next to venue remaining marked covered in a color I hadn't used. Revision history captured the login, the minute, the confidence. The edit felt like a glove being pulled tighter rather than removed. Patterns do not break because you expose them. They break because you replace them with rules that bite. I set 2 documents in separate piles on the kitchen island. One was the criminal complaint, drafted, clean, and ready to collect a file number in a window with bulletproof glass. The other was a conditional settlement letter, stricter than any apology deserves, built to travel as an exhibit if anyone treated it like a suggestion. Both piles felt like versions of love that had learned boundaries, one enforced by a docket, the other by terms that could skate into court without changing a word. On the counter, my grandmother's note sat where my eyes would land when I woke. If they call it help, ask who gets the receipt. The bank had returned the receipt. The family would decide if they wanted to learn the rest of the sentence. In the morning, the branch would finalize the reversal audit, and compliance would decide how deep to look. The contract would still show my name until I erased it with process rather than edits. The decision between badge and signature weighted like a coin on the table. Both sides honest, neither side easy, somewhere across town. A venue coordinator would expect a payment aligned with a calendar I hadn't agreed to fund. The fund itself, reborn to its number, held still like a lake after someone stops throwing stones. The next move would put words to the border I had drawn, and the person who believed smoothing could outvote rules had not yet realized the rules had. Learn my voice. Family meetings have a smell, coffee too strong, paper warmed by hands that want paper to be persuasive, air that forgets how to move. I laid my conditions on the dining table with the same precision I use when aligning a map. Restitution complete, and in writing, a signed admission that the POA was non-durable and never renewed. A notarized apology addressed to the trust itself rather than to me. And a rule that would outlive this week. No access, no discussions. No smoothing involving the fund, ever. The letter was not a threat. It was a border that had learned nouns. I placed the criminal complaint beside it like a weather forecast for anyone who mistook clarity for softness. The house listened the way houses do when history walks in. Chairs creaked at familiar weights. The refrigerator thudded, insistent as a metronome. I kept my voice out of the room and let paper do the speaking. Reversal codes mapped to thefts, teller override logs in sequence. The notary board's preliminary notice that no renewal entry existed in any journal by the commission number on the counterfeit. The audit trail did not accuse. It counted. Counting, it turns out, is louder than outrage when you do it under bright light. Banks fix math. They do not fix character. While my family treated the terms like a chess problem with a sentimental clock, compliance kept moving. The state notary commission emailed its interim finding with the bureaucratic courtesy of people who respect verbs. The stamp impression on the renewed POA did not match pressure and ink profile from any verified sample in the notary's recent work. The commission would be forwarding the case to enforcement. The sentence carried no adjectives and still managed to feel like a door closing. afternoon tilted and brought with it a sound I'd learned to recognize, a notification with the tone of something that had not planned to be seen. The bank's fraud team had located a secondary conduit, a personal checking account titled with a bright nickname, opened under my mother's profile with Alyssa as an authorized user, funded by the same under-threshold transfers that had been dripping from the trust, and dispersing to vendors through a card that disguised itself as convenience. Where the trust ledger had shown gray debits, this account bloomed with cheerful merchant names and confirmation codes that smelled like confetti. The memo lines read like party planning. The funding source read like theft. I set the new printouts on the table next to the conditional letter. The pattern grew muscle. Friday debits secondary account vendor charges, all threaded through a bank terminal that had learned to call friction relationship accommodation. The reversal sweep would pull these too. The team had already flagged the account and queued a chargeback set that marched backward in tidy steps. Money would return. The question was whether consequence would, too. Evening arrived without ceremony, but with that subtle shift rooms make when terms begin to matter more than tone. The venue contract still carried my name as sponsor. Revision history still remembered who had written it there. I added a paragraph to the settlement draft that treated revising shared documents as evidence, not etiquette. Remove my name, certify the edit history, attach the certification to the apology. It read clinical, which felt appropriate. Clinical stops leaks. Just before dark, the venue coordinator's automated reminder landed. Balance due in 10 days, penalties thereafter, polite as a guillotine. The bank's updated ledger, green with reversals, made the reminder look almost farcical. Almost. Calendars do not blush. They collect. I filed the email under receipts and slid the complaint 1 inch closer to the edge of the table where signatures become inevitable. Night tested the edges of my resolve and found them intact. The apartment above boiled pasta like a ritual. The city outside blinked its indifferent lights. The funds balance sat returned to the number my grandmother's envelope had promised. On the counter, her note kept the room honest. If they call it help, ask who gets the receipt. Today the answer was in my hands. Tomorrow it would be in theirs. The last notification of the day arrived like a match struck in a dark shed. The bank flagged a scheduled ACH from the bright-named secondary account to a third-party wallet. Set for the end of the week, labeled Final Sweep, Venue, in a memo field that mistook brazenness for efficiency. Fraud halted it. Logs preserved it. The device fingerprint matched the same branch terminal that had worn my trust thin. The reversal would take care of the money. The memo would take care of the story. I stacked the conditional settlement and the criminal complaint into 2 neat columns and slept with the decision like a coin on my tongue. Weighty. Metallic. Impossible to ignore. In the morning, one pile would become a path. The other would become a lesson I never wanted to teach but had learned how to write. At dawn, the kitchen window turned itself into a mirror. I looked like someone my grandmother would have trusted with a key. The door out of this part of the story was visible now. It only required choosing which lock to use. Morning sorted the 2 stacks into futures. On the left, the criminal complaint, cold as a courthouse hallway. On the right, the conditional settlement, exacting enough to pass for a contract. The funds balance sat fully restored, green credits marching backward over gray thefts, but money wasn't the measure anymore. It was whether paper would learn to respect the room. First Harbor called before 9 with a voice that had practiced contrition. The teller, identified in every log and camera frame, had submitted a written apology through legal. She acknowledged the override, the misuse of relationship accommodation, and the false comfort of the phrase beneficiary convenience. No justifications, only verbs that traveled, assisted, processed, bypassed. HR was handling the rest. Compliance attached a certified memo. The POA was non-durable, expired at majority, never renewed. And any branch note suggesting otherwise had been purged and replaced with the relevant clause from the original instrument. The bank could fix the ledger. Today it was fixing the language. At noon, we met under bright lights that made shadows honest. Documents waited in a fan. The reversal audit, the certification of POA expiration, a branch-level policy update that banned relationship accommodations on fiduciary accounts without legal's live approval. I initialed in the boxes that made sense and refused the ones that turned apologies into miscommunications. Signatures climbed the right margin like measured steps. On the last page, the manager placed a stamped acknowledgement of breach beside the teller's apology. If institutions can have blushes, this was it. Family didn't arrive with blushes. They arrived with timing. My mother called on the way to the branch, her tone brittle with wounded practicality. The words were the ones grievance selects when it wants a shortcut. It was still for you. We meant well. Alyssa needed a start. The line hissed when I spoke the clause slowly, non-durable, non-renewed, like the phone itself understood what paper had finally decided to say. I restated the terms: written admission, notarized apology to the trust, permanent no-access rule, edit certification removing my name as sponsor and attaching it to the apology. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was arithmetic meeting limits. The bank's last gift arrived disguised as a routine alert. A credit pull had pinged the fund's EIN through a wedding lender, one of those platforms that sell optimism wrapped in interest. The application listed me as co-signer. The signature block a cut-and-paste artwork I recognized from 6 weeks of counterfeit encounters. The timestamp aligned with a Friday. The device fingerprint matched the branch terminal that had learned to call friction help. The bank flagged the file. The platform froze the application. Legal began collecting whatever the fraud team hadn't yet captured. Even when money returns home, habits keep walking. I printed the co-signer attempt and set it on the table beside the settlement letter. It earned its own paragraph: withdraw application, certify deletion of my data, attach platform confirmation. If the settlement route lived, it would have to live in daylight. If it died, the complaint already had a space reserved for this page. Evening rolled in without ceremony, flats of gray cloud, the kind of sky that teaches houses to be their own lamps. The apartment upstairs boiled pasta with dutiful steam. I slid the conditional settlement across my mother's kitchen table and watched the paper sit between us like a third person who didn't intend to leave. Alyssa traced a corner with her nail, eyes fixed on the place where her spreadsheet had called theft a gift and a sponsor. I didn't speak. The audit trail spoke better. They signed. Not quickly, not happily, but with ink that didn't tremble. The notary stamped the page in a way pressure always knows to be permanent. I collected the originals and filed them flat in a folder labeled the way my grandmother would have labeled it. Receipts. On the drive home, my phone lit with a bank notification. The wedding lender had confirmed removal of my information. Application withdrawn, account flagged for any future attempts tied to my identifiers. The device fingerprint was attached to the message like a footprint that finally understood it couldn't walk away. Back in my kitchen, the balance sat where it belonged, and the air felt less like a court date and more like Tuesday. I taped the certification of POA expiration inside the trust folder, so the next person who tried to misremember the rules would have to start by arguing with a stamp. I put my grandmother's note on the fridge where grocery lists go. If they call it help, ask who gets the receipt. Today, the receipts had signatures. Night gave the apartment the kind of quiet that doesn't ask what it costs. Then the last notification of the day arrived. Spare and hot as a match head. The fraud team had uncovered one more account. A bright-name cousin to the secondary conduit, fed by refunds from vendors who had received the bank's clawbacks. The money that had been forced to return had been trying to circulate back out a side door. The memo field called it rebalancing. The bank would handle the funds. The paper would handle the story. Tomorrow, I would handle the choice I'd only postponed. Whether terms were enough to teach new habits, or whether only a case number could, the complaint still waited in its manila coat. It looked like winter. The bank moved first. The recirculation account, the bright-name cousin built to catch clawbacks, froze mid-breath. Refunds that had tried to sneak out a side door were yanked back through the same ledger they'd used to feign innocence. Compliance added a line I'd never seen before to the reversal audit. Anti-cert policy triggered, and the spreadsheet looked like what it was. Money returning to the place of promise said it belonged. The notary commission wrote next, a tone as dry as a law library. A formal disciplinary proceeding had opened against the commission number stamped on the forged renewal. Exemplar comparisons, inconclusive in favor of authenticity, which is a clever way of saying this isn't ink, it's toner. They requested any additional materials. I sent stills, access logs, and the line in my grandmother's addendum that had only ever needed a reader: non-durable, non-renewed. The venue received a letter that wasn't angry so much as useful. Bank case number, reversal codes, certification that funds were unauthorized, and a fresh fact every coordinator understands. Payments tied to compromised sources invite subpoenas. Their reply arrived fast and polite. Contract paused. Balances zeroed pending new arrangements. And a note that sounded like manners wearing steel shoes. We will only accept payments from verified personal accounts moving forward. That left the decision I'd been dragging like a sled across a warm street. I set the criminal complaint beside the signed settlement and ran my finger down the terms as if pressure could certify them. Admission, apology, no access rule, revision history certification, cosigner withdrawal proof. A case number would teach differently than paper. But the fund was whole. The story was documented. The bank had learned our family's names, and the venue had stepped away from the edge. I gave the complaint a home in a red folder labeled ready and placed the settlement in done. A word I didn't trust often and was still willing to use when the room looked like this. Then I wrote a letter of my own. Letter of intent. Coleman Education Trust. Forward use. In the same unromantic voice my grandmother used when she wanted a rule to outlive everyone in the room. Tuition, books, emergency health. No events, no loans, no smoothing. And a new line she would have approved. A yearly scholarship in her name for a first-generation student who keeps their library card current. Preparedness isn't paranoia. It's love with witnesses. Evening found the apartment above boiling pasta on schedule and me drafting the email I didn't want to write to the person I didn't want to be sentimental with. Alyssa would receive a copy of the bank's reversal audit, the notary notice, and my letter of intent. I left the subject line blank until the cursor stopped blinking like panic. What the fund is for. Inside, no adjectives, just boundaries. The last notification of the day arrived like a cough in a quiet theater. A wedding lender automailer had sent a friendly reminder to a list that should never have had my address. The footers included a link to a press kit, someone's side project pitching family finance hacks, with phrases I recognized from texts and teller counters. Screenshots slid into receipts without commentary. Either the lesson would land, or the red folder would learn to speak in a lobby with a badge. Night pulled the window into a mirror. The kitchen showed me standing with my grandmother's note on the fridge. If they call it help, ask who gets the receipt, and a folder marked ready within reach. The fund's balance glowed like a gauge back where it belonged. Boundaries had bitten, and the room had kept its shape. Then the phone lit with a subject line that made the floor tilt. Statement of support from the teller. The apology had grown legs, a sworn declaration naming the override. The pressure, the relationship accommodation culture at the branch, and the request that had started it. It's still for his future. She attached her internal training docs and a line no investigator ignores. I was told this family does this. It's normal. Normal is how patterns hide. Now we had a witness. The teller's declaration arrived with the weight of air changing before a storm. No adornment. Just paragraphs that turned habits into instructions under oath. She described how relationship accommodation had been taught as lubricant for good customers, how overrides wore internal codes that made exceptions look procedural, how the phrase beneficiary convenience had become a catch-all that didn't ask whose convenience counted. She named the Friday pattern, the branch terminal, the training deck, and the sentence that gave permission its costume. It's still for his future. It wasn't regret masquerading as PR. It was process, under penalty, finally telling the truth about itself. Compliance moved like a metronome after that. An internal culture audit opened across the region. Branch notes that once glowed with comforting euphemisms were quarantined. Every fiduciary account within reach was scrubbed for accommodations dressed as care. A policy memo landed in my inbox with the blush of a machine learning new manners. No overrides on trusts without legal on the line. Notarizations verified from journals, not stamps. Teller performance metrics decoupled from friction reduction when fiduciaries are involved. The memo didn't change what had happened. It changed what could keep happening. The venue did its own small act of hygiene. A blast email went out to vendors on our contract. All balances voided. New payer verification required. Funds from clawbacks, not to be reprocessed through secondary accounts. And a line in bold that sounded like civics for coordinators. Unauthorized sources invite subpoena. Do not accept workarounds. The DJ posted a cheerful story about ethics that read like marketing. The florist archived 3 posts that had aged badly beside our saga. Social doesn't fix anything, but sometimes it stops pretending it can hide what paper now carries. Home. The quiet didn't feel borrowed anymore. I drafted the Coleman Scholarship in the same practical voice my grandmother used for everything that mattered. Year 1. A single award for a first-gen student in our county. Proof of life requirements that honored libraries and receipts. Disbursement directly to institutions, never to people. A rule about late fees that read like her laugh. We do not pay for avoidable chaos. The trust, freshly defended, was turning outward the way it had always meant to. Boundaries weren't a fortress anymore. They were plumbing. Late afternoon brought the kind of mail only stubborn systems produce. Haynes and Wilder, my grandmother's old firm, sent a packet delayed by a forwarding error and bureaucracy's sense of humor. Inside, a late codicil drafted after her diagnosis, tightening the trust language from education and health to education. Health and documented emergencies only, barring third-party facilitation unless pre-cleared by counsel, and adding an automatic no-contest trigger to any attempt to recharacterize non-school events as development. It carried her pen strokes like a straight edge and the notary's bite like a closing door. The addendum didn't just agree with our week. It anticipated it. The codicil joined the folder under a strip of painter's tape as blue as every boundary we had rebuilt. My kitchen looked ridiculous. Lamps, lemons, legal paper, but it smelled like done. I could feel the complaint in its red folder humming with potential energy. I could feel the settlement in done losing its heat. The teller's sworn statement had tilted the floor under our story. If gravity needed help again, I knew which drawer held it. Evening slid into the room and found me printing 2 copies of the scholarship rules. One for the file, one for the fridge with her note. The sentence had been traveling all week from proverb to policy. If they call it help, ask who gets the receipt. Now it had a hinge. If they can't show the receipt. The answer is no. The last email of the night arrived spare and decisive. The internal audit had identified 3 other trusts with Friday accommodations at nearby branches. Reversals were in motion. Notaries were being called. A training deck had been pulled and rewritten with real consequences. The teller's declaration had become a lever, and somewhere a regional manager was. Learning that normal can be an alibi until it's in. Exhibit. I set the red folder back on the shelf where I could reach it, without looking, and turned off the kitchen light. In the reflection, the codicil seal ghosted onto the next page the way truth sometimes does when it's pressed hard enough. Morning would bring the venue's final verification. The bank's disciplinary outcomes, and one more loose and I could feel tugging at the edge of the week. The wedding lender's back-end logs and the side project that taught people how to smooth family money. If those logs didn't close clean, the red folder would come down. The house didn't brace that IT held. The audit summary arrived before coffee. 3 pages that made cause and effect sit still. Termination for the teller who smoothed overrides. Suspensions for 2 supervisors who treated relationship accommodation like a company value. Policy rewrite pushed region-wide. No fiduciary exceptions without legal listening live. Notarizations verified from journals, not stamps. And quarterly spot checks on any account tag trust or UTMA. The memo didn't spare nouns. It named the terminal, the codes, the Fridays. Vendors followed suit with a kind of brisk civic pride. The venue circulated a new rule set to their whole network. No clawback funds reprocessed, payer verification on file. And a warning in bold. Workarounds invite subpoenas. The DJ posted a tidy note about ethics. The florist quietly refunded a design fee and deleted 3 aspirational posts that had aged into exhibits. Social isn't justice, but it can stop pretending it's camouflage. Then the lender logs landed. Clean JSON exported into a PDF that read like a diary machines keep. IP addresses, device fingerprints, and invite links tied the wedding cosign attempt to a browser session at my mother's house. Then, 10 minutes later, to a masked alias that matched the email in a side project I'd already screenshotted. A family finance hacks press kit promising frictionless funding. The admin panel showed a draft course with modules titled Smoothing with POA and Trusts Without Headaches. The platform froze the account and forwarded a line only prosecutors write down without blinking. Potential instructional fraud that I printed the logs and set them beside our signed settlement. The room didn't change temperature. It changed posture. Terms had worked, money back, access revoked, apologies notarized, but the logs drew a circle wider than one wedding. This wasn't a single bad week. It was a method. The notary commission added their own brick, a formal charge against the seal used on the renewed POA, pending hearing. The phrase, toner's simulation of pressure, marched into the record where adjectives don't usually get to play. First Harbor's culture audit closed with disciplinary actions and an external monitor assigned for a year. Systems had learned to say no out loud at home. The air finally felt unremarkable. Ordinary light on the butcher block, the trust folder heavier in a way that felt like completion rather than dread. I pinned the Coleman Scholarship outline to the fridge under my grandmother's note. If they call it help, ask who gets the receipt. Beside it, a new sentence I'd stolen from the audit. Normalize verifications. Rules, unlike apologies, scale. The last item left on my desk was not a bank's problem. It was a choice I had deferred until facts had stopped arriving. The criminal complaint waited in its red folder. The teller's sworn declaration now sat on top like fuel. I could close the book with civil paper, boundaries that bite, and a scholarship that turns recovery outward, or open a chapter with a docket number that would teach the next person who tries to rebrand theft as cared at 4:17 p.m. The decision knocked for me. Literally. A plain envelope slid under my door with a return address from the county DA and a single line inside. Please contact our office. We have received multiple referrals, including a sworn statement from a First Harbor employee. The choice had become less personal and more public. Patterns don't belong to families once they start printing guides. I set the red folder on the island, next to a lemon and the scholarship draft. The apartment upstairs boiled pasta like always. Outside, the city's late light did that forgiving thing where even bad paint looks intentional. Inside, the rules we'd written stayed where we'd put them. I picked up the phone. I hosted one last conversation because stories need final punctuation. The dining table held 2 stacks, receipts, and ready. And the air held exactly one rule. We will not litigate facts. We will choose behavior. Alyssa stared at the settlement she'd already signed, and then at the subpoena with her name slanting in black. My mother folded a napkin into geometries that meant nothing. I slid across the family house rules I had typed in the same font as bank memos. The trust is infrastructure. No access, no requests, no smoothing. No cosigns, no sponsors, no aliases. If money moves, it moves with receipts and signatures in daylight. Apologies are notarized. Promises are dated. We do not rename theft as cared in. One argued. They initialed each line like adults who finally understood what ink is for. The subpoena went with them. The red folder stayed with me. Not a threat. An instrument tuned, shelved, reachable. At dusk. The DA called. Supervised agreement on the table pending court approval. Admissions filed. Financial supervision for a year. Ethics class that sounded ridiculous until you remember how we got here. And a clause that made me breathe for the first time all week. No contact with fiduciary accounts outside their own for the duration. If anyone staggered, the agreement converted to charges. Consequence had learned conditional tense. Night arrived modestly. I printed the Coleman Scholarship. 1 page, no romance, signed and scanned. A small endowment from the trust's growth, paid directly to schools. Proof of library required. Late fees declined with prejudice. I sent it to the Community Foundation with a subject line that didn't try to be clever, for students who keep receipts. 10 minutes later, an auto-reply confirmed a meeting. 10 minutes after that, I let myself feel the thing that is not triumph and not fury. It's peace that knows what room it's allowed to fill. I took the trust folder down one more time, not to check it, but to move 1 page. My grandmother's letter of intent had lived in plastic all week. Now it lived behind glass in a cheap frame on the hallway wall. Eye level, unmissable. Under it, I taped the single sentence that turned out to be the whole story disguised as advice. Normalize verifications. Rules aren't love, but love without rules is a leak. Before bed, I texted Alyssa a photo of the scholarship letter with no caption. She wrote back a single word she'd never used about money. Understood. It didn't change the past. It adjusted the future 2 degrees toward better when I killed the lights. The window held my reflection for a beat and then gave me back the city. Ordinary, unambitious, exactly enough. The fridge hummed. The apartment upstairs boiled pasta like an oath to routine. The trust balance glowed where it belonged. The red folder on the island stopped purring and went quiet, ready only if needed. That I slept without bargaining. In the morning, I would meet with the foundation, send the DA the last screenshots, and start a checklist that had been waiting behind the catastrophe: tuition deadlines, FAFSA confirmations, a printer test page that didn't carry exhibits. The scholarship would become a line item. The line item would turn into a name. The name would outlast mine. My grandmother did not believe in grand finales. She believed in receipts. We had them, and when the house settled, it sounded like what you hear when a ship slips back into its channel. Not fireworks, not applause, just water finding its level. Thank you for watching this story on True Tales Hub. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. That we post new tales twice a day, and each one comes with unexpected twists you won't see coming.